You're listening to the Sabina Road Baptist Sermon Series. We hope this message greatly impacts your life. For more information on the mission and ministries of Sabina Road Baptist Church in Tucson, Arizona, visit us online at sabinaroad.org.
Well, good morning, Sabina Road Baptist Church. Tim, thank you, and the praise band for leading us, as always. My name is Dr. Roger Daniels. I'm the Vice President at Arizona Baptist Children's Services. I direct the counseling and the leader care program. And Pastor Dallas is away today, so he's asked me to step in for him and share with you from God's Word this morning. As it's been noted, this is Memorial Day weekend. Everybody clear on that? We've said that enough. Not enough. Need to say it more, but we've made it clear already. And while there's some confusion and disagreement among historians as to the origin of Memorial Day, some records indicate that the holiday began as early as 1861, when a small group of Southerners set out to decorate the graves of fallen Civil War soldiers on June 3rd of that year. It was originally known as Decoration Day. It was established as a federal holiday in 1971. While it originated as a day to honor the men and women of our armed forces who have died in service, it's evolved into a day when we pause to remember all who have died. It's been more than 15 years ago now, but at that point I experienced one of my proudest moments as a United States citizen. I got up before the sun came up and drove the 40 miles or so from my then home in Decatur, Illinois, to the campus of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I was to attend a ceremony at first light in honor of my nephew. It was the day after he had graduated from the university and he was being commissioned as a second lieutenant in the United States Marine Corps. Now in my mind, as I'm driving through the darkness, I'm questioning, why did the ceremony have to be held so early in the morning? And then I said to myself, hey, it's the Marines. They do everything before daybreak. So literally, as the dawn's early light beamed across the center of the campus, my parents, my brother and his wife, and myself watched as my nephew stood in front of the American flag and took an oath, swearing to support and defend the Constitution of the United States of America. And as we all wiped tears from our eyes, I realized again that our nation is unique in that we ask anyone entering public service to swear allegiance not to an emperor or to a figure of royalty, but to the precepts and concepts written on a piece of paper known as the United States Constitution. I was so moved that day by this realization and this renewal in my mind and my heart that when I returned to my church office later in that day, I pulled out my old college history textbook and began to reread the Constitution. And in so doing, I was struck anew by the freedoms that it guarantees. But in a broader sense, I realized once again that freedom, any kind of freedom, isn't free. It's very expensive. It includes the freedoms that we enjoy in this country. That also includes the freedom that we have as followers of Christ. And on this Memorial Day weekend, we should realize anew the tremendous expense and sacrifice of our service people and their families, but also remember Jesus Christ, who gave his life so that each of us might receive the forgiveness of our sins and make the way for each of us to have a personal relationship with the God and Creator of the universe. See, I think about all the sacrifices that were made along in history. I think about the sacrifices of the original 12 disciples, all but one of whom died a martyr's death. I think of the great reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin and William Tyndale, who incidentally was labeled as a heretic for publishing Bibles in English and was burned at the stake with a fire fueled by the Bibles that he had published. I think of the legacy of those like Billy Graham, and I'm sure there'll be a generation after us that think of folks like Greg Laurie, who courageously and unashamedly preached the gospel to millions of people around the world. And if you hang around any church long enough, including this church, you'll hear of those who are no longer with us, but whose sacrifice and commitment contributed to the establishment and growth of this body of believers in this place. None of this would be here today if not for them. I'm reminded of a story from a pivotal time in the history of God's people. It was a time more than 40 years after God's people had been given freedom from slavery in Egypt. They had wandered as tent dwellers in the wilderness, and Moses, their longtime leader, had died. Now a new guy was in charge. His name was Joshua. And let me give you some of the background and the context. If you have your Bibles, you can begin to find the 4th chapter of the book of Joshua. But the background to the context of this chapter is that Moses has died, and God has risen up Joshua to be the new leader. And he tells Joshua in chapter 1, verse 9, he says, "Be strong and be courageous." And then he says, "Prepare the people," God said to Joshua, "prepare the people to enter into the promised land, this land that God had promised Abraham so many generations before." But there was just one problem. In order for them to get to the promised land after wandering in the wilderness, they had to get across the Jordan River into the new land. And so God told Joshua, gave him these instructions. He said, "Have the priests carry the Ark of the Covenant," which was the symbolic. It was like a big chest. You've seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? Okay, it was that big chest that represented the presence of God among his people. And God said, "Have the priests take the ark and carry it into the middle of the river." And when they did that, the water stopped, and the people were able to walk across the river on dry land, very much like they did in the Red Sea coming out of bondage and slavery in Egypt. And so that has happened. So we pick up in chapter 4, beginning in verse 1. "Now when all the nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord spoke to Joshua, saying, 'Take for yourselves 12 men from the people, 1 man from each tribe, and command them, saying, Take up for yourselves 12 stones from here, out of the middle of the Jordan, from the place where the priest's feet are standing firm, and carry them over with you and lay them down in the lodging place where you will lodge tonight.' So Joshua called the 12 men whom he had appointed from the sons of Israel, 1 man from each tribe, and Joshua said to them, 'Cross again to the ark of the Lord your God into the middle of the Jordan, and each of you take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Israel.'" Now when the imagery here is they didn't just bend down and pick up a rock. They picked up a huge stone, so much so that they had to carry it on their shoulder. Verse 6, "Let this be a sign among you, so that when your children ask later, saying, 'What do these stones mean to you?' then you shall say to them, 'Because the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it crosses the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall become a memorial to the sons or to the children of Israel forever.'" A memorial. It was important enough to God and to his people that they would establish some type of memorial so that when future generations ask about these stones, they were able to tell them something. What do these stones mean? I think I have a graphic up here of the dictionary definition of memorial. Is that up there? Oh, there it is. Found this in the dictionary. For those of you young people, that's a book that you put on the shelf that has all kinds of words and meanings. I'm just kidding because actually I got this in the online dictionary. After I looked at the dictionary on myself, I said that's too much work. I'm going to look for it online. Here's a definition. It's a noun, something, especially a structure, established to remind people of a significant person or meaningful event. And so God said, establish a memorial out of these stones to remember. Just as our nation has put aside this weekend and said we have established a memorial to remind us of significant people or significant events. It's interesting that God says to Joshua, when your children ask about these, what shall you say? And I think that's an appropriate thing for us to consider this morning as we think not only about God's people, but as we think about our country, and as we think about this, our church, whether you're a member of this church or any other church. It's important for us to remember some of the things that have gone on in the past. So when they ask, what do these stones mean? I can hear the people saying, we're going to tell them that there was sacrifice and struggle, first and foremost. For God's people, there was a great deal of sacrifice as they left the bondage and slavery in Egypt and wandered through the wilderness for some 40 years before they were allowed to cross the river and enter into the promised land. They spent their time living in tents, not having a permanent home. We look back now and see that the marvel of the temple that was placed in Jerusalem later on during the reign of King David. They didn't have a place to worship. They didn't have a home to dwell in. They wandered around as nomads, always on the move, eating the same thing every day as God provided manna coming out of heaven. And they were so sick of that they said, let's go back to Egypt, because at least in Egypt we had onions and garlic. Not having a home, it was a great sacrifice for them during that time. What do these stones mean? It meant there was sacrifice and struggle. It's the same thing in our country. We look back at our own history, the 56 signatures that are affixed to the Declaration of Independence. All of them signed that document with significant trepidation and fear as well as commitment. The last paragraph of the Declaration says, and for the support of this Declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. The founders of our country moved forward with great sacrifice and struggle. Same thing can be said of our church, whether it's this church or any other. I just happen to know that Sabino Road Baptist Church was founded in 1963. We came to this place, and there was a great deal of struggle of people giving their time and their talent and their resources, often without a lot of thanks or a lot of recognition. But when people look around and see this building or see this church at this place and this time and are apt to ask, what does it mean that this church is here? Just like in ancient times, what do these stones mean? We are to tell them. It means there was great sacrifice and great struggle. When I was the pastor at Eastview Baptist Church in Springfield, Illinois, I was about a year into my tenure as the pastor, and we had a ceremony. We had paid off the building. It wasn't my credit because I'd only been there less than a year, and the history of the church was such that the people had struggled and sacrificed, and now they had paid off their bonds, and the building was debt-free, and it belonged to them, so they had this homecoming. And they asked one of the former pastors to come and speak during this homecoming time in the celebration of what we called the burning of the bonds. And we lit those bonds on fire. I was afraid the church was going to burn down. All those flames and everything, people standing by with fire extinguishers. Pastor got up to talk about some of the sacrifices that he remembered. And I remember very poignantly him telling a story about how for 3 weeks the church had struggled and sacrificed so much, the offerings were so low that the church could not pay him his salary for 3 weeks. And so he gathered the leaders of the church early on a Monday morning. He gathered the men of the church, and he got them together, and he said, this is our situation, this is where we're at. 3 weeks behind in my salary. If you all will make a commitment and a sacrifice to bring the offerings up where they need to be, I will forego those 3 weeks of salary. Remember him telling this story. And a story like that is not unique among our churches, but there's been sacrifice and struggle along the way. So when we look around and see the building and all the instruments and all that we have here in this place called Sabina Road Baptist Church, we can look around and some will say, what does all this mean? And one of the answers is we need to tell them that there was a great deal of sacrifice and commitment. Not only that, when the children ask, what do these stones mean for the ancient people of God? Or to tell them another thing. Second thing to tell them was there was something supernatural that happened. Something that could only be explained by an action of Almighty God. In terms of God's people. I can't imagine. I do have it in my mind. You all have seen the Cecil B. DeMille depiction of the Ten Commandments, right? That old film with Charlton Heston, and the special effects of the water stopping, on the Red Sea when Moses held up the staff. You got that image in your mind, right? Some of you have never seen the movie. You need to go check Netflix and see if it's on there. I cannot conceive in my mind what it would be like to stand on the bank of the Jordan River. Now, I've stood on the bank of the Jordan River because I've toured Israel a couple of times. And it's not something I would want to wade into or swim across. But I cannot hardly imagine the fear and the trepidation of those priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant into the water and then beginning to see the water just stack up like there was an invisible dam there, and then the bottom of the river dry out so the people can walk across on dry land. That just boggles my mind. I can't hardly get my mind around that. But when future generations would see those stones that they picked up out of the river and placed as a memorial and asked the question, what do these stones mean? One of the answers is that there was a supernatural thing that happened that could only be explained by the action of God. And I think it's the same way in our country. You look back through the history of our nation and all the things that have happened, all the things for the over 250 years that have fallen into place, and how God's hand has been upon us as a nation. I read something the other day that odds makers in Vegas shudder to think about making odds about whether or not the American colonists in their uneducated, untrained militia could go up against the professional armies of Great Britain, a world power at the time, and defeat them. How do you explain that? What do these stones mean? What does this American flag mean? What does the Constitution mean? It means there was great struggle and sacrifice, but it also means that there was a supernatural intervention from God. The same way with the church. Not just talking about the building. Yes, we look around at the buildings and the campus of this place, and we hear about and read about the stories of people who have come before us, and we're apt to ask the question, the younger generation say, what does this mean? It means that it's filled with people whose lives have been changed. You see, if we had the time, and we've done this a few times, I've been in service when we've done this. If we had the time, we could go through every person here. We could give everybody a chance to speak and hear about the time in your life, or maybe the times in your life, where God has done something in your life that can only be explained by the action of Almighty God. An addict who's now recovered and sober. A family who was in conflict. A marriage on the brink of divorce. But somehow with God's intervention in the lives of his people, a miracle has happened, and now that marriage has been restored. That family is intact. That person who used to be so selfish is now generous. That person who was on his way to living eternity in separation from God has now come to Christ and has the assurance of salvation and a home in heaven. How do you explain that besides the supernatural intervention of God? When future generations ask, what do these stones mean? It means great sacrifice for which we're grateful. It means that there was a supernatural intervention of God. Some way, somehow. I remember several years ago, again, when I was pastor at Eastview Church, I challenged the church after we had paid off the building. That, okay, we've paid off the building, what are we going to do now? And it just so happened that God opened the door for us to be the sending church. Back then we called it the mother church, for a new church start. There was a village just north of us. There was a village of about 1,200 people. It didn't have a evangelical church there, and so we worked with our state denomination, state convention. We worked with the North American Mission Board to plant a church there in that new community, and we felt led of the Lord to be the sponsoring church. And so we called a mission pastor, and he joined our staff. He was put out there to begin Bible studies and to begin that church, and it took us 5 years and lots of conflict and lots of struggle. And several times in the midst of that, we saw God do some wonderful things. And I remember the Sunday after we had constituted the new church. We had done a lot of things. We put a lot of money and a lot of talent, a lot of resources into that church. In fact, when we got ready to launch that church, I felt God leading me to preach a sermon about how lay people can become missionaries. And I preached on the Macedonian call from the book of Acts. And I invited people to come and be missionaries and go serve in this new church start for a month or for 3 months or for 6 months or for a year, and then come back to the mother church. And when the invitation was given that morning, I about had a stroke, because there was more people at the front volunteering for mission service than there were out in the congregation. And then I remembered the story about the former pastor who was 3 weeks behind in the salary, and I thought, okay, what have we just done? 5 years later, a new church is established in a new community. And I'm sitting in my office on a Monday morning, and the church treasurer comes in. And we had done, again, like I said, we put a lot of money, a lot of things into this new church start. Church treasurer comes into my office and he says, "Pastor, a couple things I want you to see." Now, when the church treasurer comes into the pastor's office and says, "There's a couple things I want you to see," it strikes fear in the heart of a pastor. You just have to understand that. And so church treasurer pushed a piece of paper across my desk and he said, "This is a treasurer's report from the month where we started the new church start. Look at the bottom line." Okay, I looked at the bottom line. He said, "Now, here's the treasurer's report that I'm going to give in the church this month." He pushed that across my desk. He said, "Look at the bottom line." In 5 years, we'd given tens of thousands of dollars to this new church start. And by the time the new church had been established, the bank account at the mother church was within $100 of what it was 5 years ago. For God had given everything back to us, miraculously. What do these stones mean? For the Israelites, these stones meant that God did a miraculous thing by stopping the water. What does our flag, what does our Constitution mean? It means God's been with us as a nation for all of these years, all these decades. What do these stones mean for the church? It means that God has done some miraculous things in the lives and the hearts of the people and as the church corporately. One last thing. What do these stones mean? Sacrifice. God's intervention. When they ask what these stones mean, tell them there was a willingness to move forward in faith. You see, when God's people, when they set up those stones, God told Joshua, "Set them up in the place where you're going to lodge tonight." Did you get that? A lodge. Structure. They'd been living in tents for 40 years. And so they moved on across the Jordan River and they came to a place called Gilgal. And it was there that they lodged and began to have homes, and they set up all the stones as a memorial. But that wasn't the final resting place or stopping place. No, they spent some time there at Gilgal. And their next stop was Jericho. Because you see, as God had given them this new land, it wasn't going to be a land without struggle. So when they set up those stones there, and the children began to ask, what do these stones mean? One of the answers is there's a willingness to go forward in faith. They didn't just stay at Gilgal. They could have stayed around Gilgal and admired those stones for centuries, but they didn't. They moved on to Jericho, and when they got to Jericho, they encountered some problems. There was a strong army. There was a fortified city. And so God told them, walk around the city, blow the trumpets, go around 7 times, and eventually the walls tumbled and fell, and there was victory. You know, the same mission pastor that we called, he was a 25-year-old young man just out of seminary, and had a meeting with him one time. We were talking about, how's it going? How's the new church? We met on a regular basis, and so this one particular meeting, we met at the appointed time and place, and he walked into our meeting place, and he was all sweaty and dusty. I said, man, what have you been doing? He said, well, this morning in my devotion, I read from Joshua where they walked around the city 7 times. He walked around the city 7 times that day, all sweaty. Okay, there's some things you take literally, and there's some things that you don't take literally, okay, from the scriptures. And so he was out there, moving forward in faith. When the people left Jericho, they went on to the victory in Jericho, they went on to a place called Ai. It was spelled A-I. And there they suffered defeat. And it was there they committed the sin of Achan. Now eventually they had victory there, but it wasn't without struggle. And God tested them along the way. But yet they were willing to move forward in faith. And after that place, they went on to Lebanon. And they had to fight against the Gibeonites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and so many other nations that were there occupying that land. And at each stage, they had to adjust their strategy. They couldn't just do the same thing over and over. God did not have them walk around every city and every encampment of the enemy. No, God gave them ways to vary their approach. And so when the children would ask, what do these stones mean? They would say there was a willingness to go forward in faith. The same thing, I think, with our country. I think America is still the greatest place. And I think that there is a belief that exists among our population, no matter where you are on the political scale, there's a belief that things will eventually get better and injustice will be defeated. How many times have you heard about the next election? There's this belief, this underlying thing about us in our country that says we know better days are ahead of us. As I look back in retrospect, I'm glad that there was an American Revolution back in the mid 1700s. I'm glad I didn't live through it, but I'm glad it happened. In fact, I saw something that made me chuckle this week. I saw somebody's post on Facebook. This is not to offend those who were all about the royal wedding, but I saw a post on Facebook that said, the last time I was concerned about a royal wedding was 1776. I just thought that was funny. Only 2 of you thought it was funny. Okay. I'm glad we had a civil war. I mean, I don't want to live through it, but I think, I'm glad that now we have states' rights and we no longer are a country that enslaves people. I'm glad that we went through something called the suffrage movement of the early 1900s. It allowed women to vote. I'm glad that we went through the civil rights movement in the 60s and the 70s, and I do remember living through that. It wasn't just in history books. I wouldn't want to have been a part of that. There's a lot of conflict, but you know what? A wise man once told me that there's very little conflict in a cemetery. The conflict means that there's passion and there's life. And in retrospect, I realize that conflict generates discussion, and discussion generates ideas. And it allows people who are a lot smarter than me to come along and work on and advance the problems because we're willing to move forward in faith. Even the current conflicts that our country has, I don't think they're a bad thing because I think it helps us define and redefine who we are. Trusting God through all that, we're willing to move forward in faith. Now let's come to our church. What do these stones mean? There was a willingness to move forward in faith, the Israelites did, into this new promised land to drive out the enemies. And our country looking forward, thinking that things are going to get better. In the church, we have to be careful about the stones of tradition. See, I think sometimes in the church we are guilty of sitting around those stones as in Gilgal and bowing down to them. almost worshiping the traditions. You know, there's, maybe I've told this joke before, but you've heard all the light bulb jokes, right? Of how many blank it takes to change a light bulb. And one of the jokes is, ask the question, how many Baptists does it take to change a light bulb? And the answer is, first of all, you have to form a committee. And second of all, after you change the light bulb, there's always going to be a group of people around who are going to continue to talk about how good the old light bulb was in comparison to the new one. But see, isn't that a description of who we are many times? That we're guilty of looking back and not forward. That the stones of tradition are rampant. And as God's people moved through the promised land, you know what they did? I've said it already. They varied their approach as God led them. That they didn't use the same way every time to accomplish the same purpose. I think sometimes we can be guilty of that. Instead of moving forward in faith, we would rather stay in the traditions because it's nice and comfortable and it's warm and cozy. Nothing ever remains the same. Not our bodies, not our families, not our culture, not even our churches. And so this is going to shock some of you, but in the mid to early, or the early to mid 1600s in the history of the church, English Bibles were not even allowed. You could be put to death if you had the copy of the Bible in English. Can you imagine that? I can't imagine that. There was a controversy in the 1600s among Baptists as to whether or not we should be allowed to sing hymns in church. Because a hymn was defined as something that was written by man. What'd they do up to that point, you ask? Well, they read from the Psalms because that was the songbook of the Old Testament. Not too long ago, well, I guess it's been several years now, where I was in a church growth conference, and I heard a speaker by the name of Eddie Stanley. You may not, or Andy Stanley. You probably never heard of Eddie Stanley. Andy Stanley, you probably haven't heard of him, but you've probably heard of his father. His name's Charles Stanley. And Andy Stanley, I'm going to get everybody confused. Andy Stanley was remarking to this church growth conference about the changes inherent in growing a church and responding to the culture. And he told this story. He said, you know, I watched my father as pastor at First Baptist Church of Atlanta, Georgia. That every time he made a change, he lost members. The first time he had a guitar on stage, he lost members. The first time that he had the drum set on stage, he lost members. Then he said, first time my mother wore slacks to church, he lost a lot of members. This is Andy Stanley talking about his dad, Charles Stanley. You see, so many times we are guilty of looking at those stones, if you will, of tradition. And instead of saying, these stones represent sacrifice, represent God's miraculous activity, represent our willingness to go forward in faith, we sit around and we talk about how good all these stones are, when they are to help us to remember so that we can move forward. Does that make any sense? And so as we look back at this story, and this weekend, as we pause and remember the sacrifice, as we think about and we hold gratitude in our heart for those who have made sacrifices before us, and when we recognize that along the way God has done something at every step that's supernatural, it's a reflection upon the God that we worship and serve. But then it's up to us to remember that it's time for us to carry on and to move forward in faith, that God will provide and intervene just like he did in ancient times as we are faithful to him. And I'm going to ask you for a minute to bow your head and close your eyes. This is a time when no one's looking around, and I'm not one of those that's going to ask for a show of hands, because I think that the commitment, the relationship you have between you and God is to be between you and God. And it may be that you're here today and your attitude has been one of of not having any gratitude in your heart for those who have come along and sacrificed. Maybe it's time for you, right here where you sit, between you and God, to say, God, wow, I need to find a place in my heart of gratitude for those who have sacrificed before. Maybe it's time for you this morning just to pause and to recognize and thank God for those moments when He has showed up and you couldn't explain what happened. A body that was healed, a friendship that was restored, a life that was changed. Maybe yours. To celebrate and acknowledge God's intervention. It may be this morning that in the quietness of this moment between you and God, you need to say to God, I'm willing. I'm willing to move forward in faith. Don't know what's coming. New pastor will be here soon, we hope and pray. Don't know how he's going to lead us, but God, in my heart, let me be open to your movement, open to any changes so that we can move forward. I can move forward in faith. Dear God in heaven, we ask for your presence and power to be upon us today, each of us, but also as a church, as a country, so that we may continue the legacy that was began so many centuries ago, moving forward into where you would have us. So we surrender ourselves to you now. In Jesus' name.